So I gave a sort of version of this talk a couple of years ago, and what I invariably discover when I give talks like this is that the subject that I pick is usually too big to fit. So one time I decided I was going to do the French Revolution, and I got into doing it. I was like, what on earth am I? People give whole courses on the French Revolution, and I'm like, yeah, I'll do it in an hour and 15 minutes or whatever course. So I got into it, and then I said to myself, well, I've got to stop. So I'm going to stop at the flight to Varennes when the king tries to escape, and then I'll do another one. But that also proved to be too much. So what I want to sort of settle on today is this incident that happened on June 20th, 1789. The night of June 20th, it's often used as what they call a metonym. So a metonym is like if you say the White House when you mean the US government. Like it's a sort of short way of referring to something. And the night of June 20th is a kind of metonym for this fundamental change that happens in France in the summer of 1789. And the reason why I think this is interesting, and not sort of purely out of kind of academic interest, is that it's a moment of really fundamental transformation and part of a larger sort of pattern. So we know that, we kind of celebrate the 4th of July, 1776, as the kind of birth of the nation, if you will. But really, the sort of founding of the kind of America as we know it in a lot of respects is the Constitutional Convention of 1787. There's a really great book by a guy whose name is escaping my brain right now called The Founders' Coup, about the Constitutional Convention of 1787, when they were sort of, it was called, the premise of calling it was that they were going to fix the Articles of Confederation. And then everybody showed up in Philadelphia, and Alexander Hamilton was like, well, actually we're just junking it, and we're going to come up with a new constitution entirely, to which a lot of the people who came were like, wait, I didn't sign up for that. But there's a really fundamental change going on here in North America, and at the same time, and for some of the same reasons, a really fundamental change going on in France. So to start out, I want to talk just a little bit about what France was like in the 1780s. France, the population was growing relatively quickly. In 1700, I think the population of France was about 18 million. By the 1780s, it was about 26 million, which seems like a kind of a slow rate of growth by the standards of the 20th century, when there's more people just sort of generally. And also the infant mortality rate is considerably lower now than it was 200 years ago. Paris by this time has a population of 600,000, which makes it one of the very largest cities on earth. France at this point is what's called an absolute monarchy. So the king, who at this point is Louis XVI from the Capet family, rules by a right that comes directly down from God to him. Now this is a fundamental difference from how things had been in the sort of more feudal, the more properly feudal period that occupied a lot of the period between the end of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the 16th century. There's a very sort of complex and sort of multifaceted process that goes along with monarchs trying to sort of assert their right to be the king, and the nobility trying to assert their right to sort of say, well, the king is kind of first among equals. So this is why the Magna Carta in England is very important, because that's the point at which the English nobles get the king to sign a document saying, we have these rights, you can't just sort of decide to ignore them. And then of course the king does ignore them. I mean, one of the interesting thing about the Magna Carta, if you read British history, is that English kings sort of studiously ignore it whenever they can. Sometimes their power or their need for money gets to be such that they can't ignore what the nobles want. But whenever they can, they do. So what you get now is a system developing, this system of absolutism, in which power and sort of legitimate authority is personified in the body of the king. There's this sort of famous moment when Louis XIV is sort of asked, some question about the state, and he says, and this could be apocryphal, it's hard to say, but l'état c'est moi, like I am the state. And he meant literally that was true, right? That he was France in a certain sense. There's a really interesting sort of literature on how, there's a kind of famous passage in Foucault's Discipline and Punish when he describes the execution of a guy who tried to assassinate the king, and it's very gruesome. And he gets like drawn and quartered and eviscerated and all kinds of things. And the reason being, according to this way of thinking, is that the kind of because he's challenged the power of the king by trying to kill him, the power of the king has to be kind of reinscribed in his body by like cutting him to bits while he's still alive. But it's very much a sort of process that goes on in which the political power becomes kind of embodied in this individual. But there's also a process of the state starting to exist abstractly, if you will, and here's what I mean by that. So if you were a king in kind of the feudal period, you basically could be king over lots of different people. So if you were the Habsburg emperor, you'd be emperor over Germans and Czechs and Poles and Hungarians and Ruthenians and Bohemians and all great variety of people. What's beginning to happen now in France is the development of a kind of a nation, in the sense that, now this is a term that goes back further than that, but you start seeing this transformation. So France has a whole bunch of ethnic groups within it, the Aquitains and the Bretons, the Bretons and the Provençal, and various other Basques down sort of toward the border with Spain. And they speak different languages. So, and you'll still hear them sometimes if you go to Brittany or the Basque Country or some parts of Provence. You'll hear these languages which are distinct from French, and which are not just versions of French, but just different actual languages, not mutually comprehensible. Especially Basque. There's a great debate about where Basque came from, because it's not very similar to any other European language that they can find. But you start getting this process that's going to eventually lead to the idea of Frenchmen and the idea of France as a kind of thing that's not like the property of the king. So for instance, we think of the United States, who does it belong to? Well, us in a certain sense. Like every American, it's not like the president is the king. It's not like it belongs to him. And it's not like it would stop existing, right? So say that the government collapsed tomorrow, it's not like America would stop existing. It would just be, we'd have to find another way of putting it together. So France at this time is run by an incredibly complicated system, which I'm going to give you some of the flavors of. People, you look at American sort of governmental life, bureaucratic life, and you're like, oh my God, it's just fabulously complicated. It's so much simpler and more straightforward. Maybe not in the way that it operates, but at least the kind of theory of it is more simple and straightforward. A lot of France sort of practically is run by a group of courts called the parliaments. These aren't the parlement. They're not like parliaments like the British Parliament, but they're actually law courts that have 13 members and are 12 or 13, that certify the laws. So when the king issues a law, it has to be kind of promulgated by the parliaments. We'll talk about that in a little bit. French society now is being changed for the course of a lot of this 17th century, or the 18th century, excuse me, by the rise of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is an incredibly complicated intellectual movement. It's a little hard to summarize. If you're interested in the Enlightenment, I recommend Peter Gay's book that's just called, it's 2 volumes, it's called The Enlightenment. It's a little dated now, and there's more recent research, but it's worth reading because Gay is a great writer, and it's a really interesting book, and it'll give you a kind of a way of understanding what the Enlightenment was all about. But it's basically this idea that human reason is the kind of best way of understanding the world, as opposed to religion, which many of them regard as sort of purely superstitious. There's some like D'Holbach, I grew up like having learned German, and in German if you see a letter, you say a letter, which is why I can't speak French, because like the French are all about, let's not say that letter. So D'Holbach, who is a very extreme rationalist and really didn't, was very much against religion generally, because he just didn't think that it conformed to the way human reason worked. So the French kings and a lot of the French aristocracy, the French kings particularly, want to kind of keep a lid on this, right? Because if the basis of your power and authority is divine right, and you have all these people going around being like, well, maybe there is no God, or maybe God is like a sort of divine watchmaker who sort of set the thing going and then like just let it go. That creates a kind of fundamental question about why it is that you have the right to rule. So this is something which you can kind of see in the political arguments and political ideas, both in France, and they get translated into North America. Our sort of the ideas of our founding fathers are very much touched by the Enlightenment, the kind of deist version of Christianity in which God is a sort of a little less. If you look at the sort of actual Christian views of the Founding Fathers, they thought that, they weren't so much into this kind of personal relationship with God type of thing, but more that God was this sort of had created things and kind of rules within it, and we had to work with those. And I mean, the idea, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The idea that all men were created equal is, to put it quite frankly, a revolutionary idea. I mean, it seems normal to us right now, right? I mean, it's the thing you learn when you take civics in school, if they taught civics to anybody anymore, that the fundamental premise of American government is that every human being is created equal, that they have certain inalienable rights, and among these are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you told this to a French aristocrat in the middle of the 18th century, he would have sounded like, a lunatic radical. I mean, it would have just been like, very startling to him to hear this. Also, so France at this time is a very Catholic country. Roman Catholicism is the official religion. French society is broken down into 3 orders or estates. The first estate is the clergy, that comprised about 130,000 people, or 0.5% of the population. That's all the priests, all the bishops, the whole hierarchy. Then there's the nobility. They're the second estate. That's about 390,000 people, or about 1.5% of the population. And then the third estate, that's everybody else. All the lawyers, all the professionals, all the people in the street, they're all technically part of the third estate, and roughly about 25 million people. If you were a noble, you were not allowed to make money from trade, technically. You were also exempt from certain taxes, although taxation is one of the big issues here, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But at this time, Protestantism is kind of spreading in France. Jansenism, which is a kind of dissident sect of Catholicism, is spreading. And there's a lot of debate going on within the church about, I mean, once the Protestant Reformation happens in the 16th century, all of a sudden there's kind of a free market in religion. If you're the Catholic Church and you're looking at the world in a kind of top-down, like God, Pope, the whole 9 yards, like the idea that there might be other people thinking, well, we have this direct path to God that doesn't involve going through the institutions of the church, that's a very dangerous idea. This is why people are getting burned at the stake about this issue. As a matter of fact, the famous French essayist, Michel de Montaigne, says, we put a great stock in our ideas if we're willing to roast a man alive on the basis of them. And this is Montaigne's way of saying, like, maybe don't be so sure that you know the truth about every single thing. So this is, sorry, we're in a little smaller thing, but it's okay. This is just, I put this up. This is the kind of political divisions of France. It's basically a bunch of like sort of areas that had been collected by the French kings over the course of several hundred years. This is the ecclesiastical map of France, and the reason I'm showing you these two things, you don't really have to look at them very closely, but if you just notice, the ecclesiastical map and the political map are two different things. And then, this is the map of the areas controlled by the different parliaments. The main one, the biggest one, the most powerful one is the Parliament of Paris. Not surprisingly, there's a very spatial quality to government in France at this time. Like, power is really very much coalesced in Paris. And when the revolution really gets rolling, and the heads get rolling, one of the things that's worth remembering about Paris is that the center of Paris where this is happening is really small. Like, it's all within about a square, maybe 2 square miles where all the action is happening, or most of it. Not counting, of course, Versailles, which is sort of off a little ways out of town. So the different sort of regions of France were divided into 3 groups. The pays d'élection, which were the sort of older groups, that's the older possessions of the king, those are the white ones. And the pays d'état, those are sort of more recent acquisitions. And then there's the pays d'imposition, the yellow ones, and those are the ones that have been captured most recently. And why is this important? Only because, like, the tax structure was different depending on which one that you were in. The tax structure, if you think that the tax structure of the United States now is complicated, and it is, I've messed up my taxes pretty much every year since 2009. This is in a whole other zip code of complication. This is one of my favorite sort of French revolutionary images. This is a piece of sort of political cartooning, and you can see this is the first estate. The guy you can see in purple, he's got the sort of the crucifix on his chest, and then the second estate, the noble, he's sitting there, he's got a sword. To carry a sword, you had to be a noble. And then they're riding on the back of a guy. The caption says, "We must hope this game will end soon," because the guy we're riding on is about to collapse and we need to find another one. You know, if you ever see the History of the World Part 1, the Mel Brooks movie, they're sort of that scene that happens at Versailles is not totally wrong. I mean, they didn't have a guy going around with a bucket or whatever, but it was very, if you were a member of the nobility, you were really just not subject to the normal kind of rules that most people were subject to. Taxes. I just included, I happened to be checking around on the internet and I found my favorite Wizard of Id comic frame where the king is standing there and one of his guards leans out and says, "The peasants are revolting," and the king says, "You can say that again." Really, the king really viewed the role of the vast majority of the people in France as produce, pay your taxes, be quiet, serve in the army when it's required of you. And that was it. And there was a whole range of taxes. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the tile, it was the tax that applied to most people. It was about 150 years old, I think, by this point. It was applied to property, it was applied to people. There was the gabelle, which was the salt tax, which was varied very, very widely by region and was really annoying to people because, I mean, so salt is very important. Why? Because it's used in food preservation. It's not just to make your soup taste better. It's to keep the fish from turning or the beef from turning in between when you butcher it and when you eat it. So the price of salt is a big deal. And if it's one thing in one place and another thing in another place, the result is, in a place like France, a very intense and avid black market gets going because it's, there's money to be made by moving salt from a place where it's less expensive to a place where it's more expensive. These were all quite annoying to people. For a long time it was believed, or the sort of historical view was that the nobility paid no taxes, and this is not really true. They did pay some taxes. They paid less than the people who weren't noble. If you were a noble, you weren't allowed to engage in trade. If you were a noble, there were just certain occupations you weren't allowed to have, but sort of payback was that a lot of the taxes didn't apply to you. But they hated them nonetheless, and one of the big sort of recurrent political problems in France in the course of the 18th century is the government, which was perpetually short of money, trying to come up with ways to rationalize the tax structure. At this point, they have literally what are called tax farmers, fermiers généraux, farmers general, and basically, so say if you're the fermier généraux for this area, you have to come up with a certain amount of money. Now, if you manage to collect in taxes more than that amount of money, it's probably all right if there's a bit of a rake-off, and that's really the reason for wanting to be one of these things. And it's the way that the state at this point is more rationalized, more bureaucratically centralized than it had been 100 years previously. But it's still difficult to get things done. They don't have, people look at the bureaucracy and this kind of thing and like, oh my God, it's like, but the fact of the matter is, in a modern mass society, nothing gets done without bureaucracy. The question is, does the bureaucracy work right? And that's a whole other issue. The thing that we're mostly annoyed about is not that there's bureaucracy, but that the bureaucracy develops ideas of its own about how things are supposed to be done instead of doing them the rational, efficient way that bureaucracy is supposed to facilitate. Still a hard pill to swallow when you have to wait for 3 hours in the DMV, but there you go. So France in the 1780s is broke. And part of the reason is because of the series of wars that they've involved in, particularly the the 7 Years' War, of which the French and Indian War in North America was a part. Sometimes people talk about war as being obscene, but it's really obscenely expensive. And especially in the 18th century, when you have to build all these ships and you have to get people from place to place, and it takes, a month or two to get between continents, and armies have, at this point, because they're professionalized, are less wont to live off the land. There's that old sort of saying about an army marches on its stomach. One of the kind of general European memories was the 30 Years' War, in which armies just went from place to place, despoiling whoever they found and eating it. And so, any of you who've ever heard the children's story about Stone Soup, where the 3 soldiers show up and manage to convince the townspeople to get out all their food, that's a kind of a lingering memory of the 30 Years' War, when if you were a peasant or even a town dweller, you would really dread an army showing up, because it meant that they were going to take all the food that, a bunch of armed, hungry guys showing up is just not a good situation, right? The French government is constantly trying to find sort of more sources of money, and one of the things that they want to do is extend taxation to the nobility, because it's like they asked Willie Sutton, the bank robber, why he robbed banks, right? And his answer was, because that's where the money is. And that's why they wanted to extend taxation further to more extensively into the nobility, because they were the people who really had the money. In the 1780, a guy named Jacques Necker, who's Swiss, if I recall correctly, is appointed as the finance minister, and he goes through systematically looking at the accounts. This is another thing. So one of the things about being king in an absolutist system is you really don't have to give an account of yourself very much. So it was not really known exactly how much money, like what the budget was. And partly too, you have Versailles, where the kind of royal court is, and where a lot of money is getting spent keeping up appearances, if you will. So the king has to live in a certain style. He also wants to have his nobles around him, because he wants to keep an eye on them. You want to keep your friends close and your enemies closer, but you want to keep the nobles around because you want to make sure, keep an eye on what they're doing and play them off against each other. So Necker goes through and systematically looks at the French accounts, and then he publishes the results in what's called the Compte Rendu in 1781, which was a bad move on his part, because the last thing the king wanted was a public statement. Why would you give a public statement of your accounts, right? He claimed that revenues exceeded spending by 10 million livres a year. He was probably wrong about that. He was probably grossly underestimating the cost of the wars in North America. Oddly, one of the consequences of the French helping us win our war of independence against the British was that they bankrupted themselves. They just spent fantastic amounts of money. Sending naval forces and land forces from France to North America is not a cheap prospect at all. So he is dismissed, because nobody likes a disturber, right? And when you're king, you can just get rid of the disturber. So what arises in the course of the 1780s is this movement by the French monarchy to try and find new sources of taxation. And the nobles say, well, no. If we're going to have any new taxes, they have to be approved by something called an Estates General, a meeting of all the estates of the realm. This hasn't happened since the 1630s. And here we come upon one of those interesting facts of government, which is that every now and then I hear someone say, well, let's have a constitutional convention. And that's about the last thing you would ever want to have happen. For the reason that, look at what happened the last time we had a constitutional convention. They basically just threw out the old constitution and which was the Articles of Confederation, and came up with an entirely new one. One I kind of like. It's U.S. Constitution has some problems, there's some points that are unclear, but I think by and large, you look at the Constitution and it's pretty okay. So some people will be like, well, we need to have a constitutional convention to fix this or that aspect of the Constitution. And I keep thinking, no. When you have a constitutional convention, lots of things can get changed. And, it's one of those be careful what you wish for type of things. And this is the most catastrophic instance of be careful what you wish for in the history of Western civilization, I think. So they have these sort of public meetings in 1787 and 1788 of kind of notables. Like, so if you're just sort of like Joe Schmo in the street, you're not going to get to do this. But so this is meetings of the estates. And what becomes clear is that although the third estate makes up about 98% of the population, voting happens not by head, but by estate. So a process, a proposal is put forward, and there's essentially 3 votes to be had. The first estate, the second estate, the third estate. And it doesn't matter how many actual people are in each one of these, they each get 1 vote. Each estate gets 1 vote. Well, if you're the kind of person who's out there trying to kind of expand your tax base, this is a problem, because the people who are already getting taxed probably most heavily only have 1 vote. And the people who you would like to tax more heavily get 2 votes. You know, sometimes the electoral math is complicated, but not in this case. I mean, it's pretty straightforward what's going on. So there's a kind of movement among third estate people, and once again, it's not just like Joe Schmo in the street, which it will become. I mean, when the revolution really gets cracking in the early 1790s, you have guys standing on barrels on the street corner, like whipping up the crowds in the streets. But this is a case where the third estate, and the third estate is businessmen, lawyers, teachers, all kinds of educated people figuring out who they are. And there's a very famous tract that gets published in January 1789 by the abbot, Emmanuel Joseph Saez. He's one of those guys who, you could be an abbot, or you could be a sort of official in the church, Catholic Church, without necessarily being all that involved in ecclesiastical affairs, and Saez is one of these people. But he writes this text called What is the Third Estate? And it starts with these 3 very sort of powerful propositions. What is the third estate? Everything. It's 98% of the people in this country, right? What has it been hitherto in the political order? Nothing, right? The first and second estate are the people who really run things in the country. What does it desire to be? To become something. What does it mean for the third estate to become something? It means for the people, however you want to interpret that term, and how you want to interpret that term, you know, the devil is very much in the details, want to become the source of political authority, want to be invested with political authority, which by this point has been pretty much limited to the people in the first and second estate, this very small stratum of people up at the top of society. The third estate is a nation within itself. The third estate embraces all that which belongs to the nation, and all that which is not the third estate cannot be regarded as being of the nation. That's a pretty revolutionary reversal, right? So it's not just that the third estate wants to be something. The third estate is really everything, and the rest of these people are kind of dead weight. Like, what is it that what do the nobles, what do the church bring to the country? Like, the third estate are the people who make the food. They're the people who interpret the laws. They're the people who do the business. They're the people who produce. The rest of these people just sit around. I mean, the nobles, you know, mostly they're just sort of like raking off the produce of more productive people. Around this time, 24th of January, Louis finally says, okay, we're going to summon the Estates General. This is a weird time because nobody really knows. There's nobody alive who's actually been in an Estates General. Nobody really knows what you're supposed to do at an Estates General or how you're supposed to organize. I mean, they have rough ideas, but they decide that they're going to have sort of elections in the sort of localities for different delegates. The first estate, the clergy will get 303 delegates, of whom 2/3 are parish priests. This is an important thing, right? Because the parish priests are the kind of frontline troops of the church. It's not the abbots, the people who run the abbeys. It's not the bishops. It's the parish priests. And they have a different set of interests, maybe, than the people further up the hierarchy. The second estate gets 282 delegates. Well, you can generally assume that they all have roughly the same sort of take on things. I mean, there's a kind of class consciousness, if you will, for lack of a better term, amongst those people. And then the third estate is going to get 578 delegates. 50% of whom are lawyers or local officials. I included this quote, which if I recall correctly, is from Henry V. First thing we do, we kill all the lawyers. There's an argument to be made that a lot of the things that happen in the French Revolution later on result from the whole thing being run by lawyers. Practically every major figure in the sort of French Revolution after about 1790 is either a lawyer or has some legal training. There's some exceptions, but. Now, what's the key feature here? So there's 578 delegates from the Third Estate. There's 282 from the Second and 303 from the First. So there's 585 from the first two estates, but who cares? The whole point is that there's only 3 votes to be had, right, at this point. And there's a lot of debate that goes on about whether the voting system should be done by head. And it's not hard to figure out who was on which side of this debate. Another thing they did was collect what were called the Cahiers de doléances. For those of you who remember the Seinfeld episode about Festivus, this is the statement of grievances, the airing of grievances. And this was, in all the localities, people were invited to suggest what they thought the problems with the country were. This is a bizarre moment because in the sort of earlier version of France, if you got out there and started criticizing the way things were going in the country, there was a good chance you were going to go to jail. I mean, it was really not, there wasn't this sort of idea of political freedom in the way that, one of the great things about being an American is that you can talk about how much of the government is terrible, but talk about how terrible the government is. And you're free to do so. As a matter of fact, it's your God-given right according to the Constitution. This is I've spent a lot of time in Germany, and I always feel kind of bad there because I don't want to beef about, there's things that irritate me about the way they do things there. But I don't want to beef about it because it's not really my country. In America, I can beef about everything. But that's our thing. That's one of the things that really defines us as a people, is that we have the right to do that. There's such a thing as a loyal opposition. You can sort of say, well, I think that this way of doing things is bad, we should do it some other way. In France at this time, you're taking a bit of a risk if you're going to get out in public and say stuff like that. So you can see these are some of the original cahiers. This is from the clergy of Paris. This one is from grievances, demands, and representations of the Order of the Third Estate of the island of Corsica. This is the list of complaints and grievances of the residents of the parish of Saint-Forget. And you can see it's written in a very nice hand, but it's written by hand. This is all there's a very kind of low down, sort of ground level political agitation going on here. And it's really interesting too, at this point people are not let's get rid of the monarchy. The vast majority of pretty much all of what's in the Cahiers is suggestions for how things can be done better. The key here is that the monarchy still is legitimate, right? What the king says is still legitimate. The political order, in the large sense, is still legitimate. This is a sort of, you kind of can't see this, but I'll read it most for you, a sort of breakdown of what was in the Cahiers. The nobility, their top 10 concerns were regular meetings of the Estates General. Why? Because this is a way that the nobles can assert control over the French state, right? Taxation in general, not surprising. This is a funny thing about, taxation is always an interesting topic to talk about historically, right? Because this sort of fundamental premise of the American Revolution is no taxation without representation. And of course, as I mentioned always at moments like this, people don't like taxation with representation. People have a real interest in kind of getting into a position where they can defend themselves from that. Veto on taxation for the Estates General, the establishment of provincial political structures, censorship, personal liberties, allocate authorizations for arrest. So it was the case at this point that they could just sort of send out what was called a letter to Cahiers, and just arrest you. I mean, this is when you have the king. There's a sort of moment at which the king says something in one of these meetings, and his brother says, "Well, Your Highness, I don't think that that's legal." And the king says, "It is legal because I will it." And that gives you a sort of real insight into his sort of thinking process. There's no law that exists abstractly that if I'm the king, I might violate. If I'm the king, what I say is the law, right? And people then need to adjust from there. In the towns, taxation in general is number one. Provincial estates, once again, devolving of power down to the localities. Regular meetings of the Estates General. Vote by head in the Estates General. Why? Because the towns are full of third estate people who want an actual say in what's going on. Veto on taxation. Lack of career opportunities in the military. If you were in the French army, officer positions were the sort of pretty much the exclusive preserve of nobles, except in some areas like artillery where you had to have some sort of mathematical knowledge to do it. Like if you're an artillerist, if you don't know the math, the shells aren't going to go to the right place, so that you like to have people who really like have some, it's like being an airline pilot. You can be a really nice guy, but unless you know how to fly the plane, being a stand-up person is less useful. And then in the rural parishes, this is the peasantry really, taxation, the salt tax, right? Oh my God, we don't want to pay the salt tax. Or we would like it to be, regular and predictable. Taxation on alcoholic beverages, that I don't think needs much explanation. The salt monopoly, the salt distribution was a monopoly of the government. Tax on legal acts, so this is like the Stamp Act in our revolution. If you're going to file any documents, you have to pay to get it done. Compulsory labor services on the roads. This is something that's often called the corvée. So if you were a peasant in France, you would have to give a certain number of days a month to the government to go out and fix the roads, which, if you're a peasant, why am I out here? I have my own farm. I want to be working on that rather than fixing potholes somewhere down the way. Provincial estates is kind of down the list of considerations. Praise of Louis XVI. Once again, there's a very sort of deeply felt loyalty to the idea of France, or to the idea of the king. Let's be clear. And tax exemptions and privileges enjoyed by the clergy. They felt that so for instance, when the clergy owned agricultural land, that was not in the structure of taxation. So this is the first meeting of the Estates General. You can see over here the clergy. You can see over here the nobility, and then all these guys here, they're all dressed like lawyers. And that's the third estate. Because a large proportion of them are lawyers for reasons that make a certain amount of sense, right? Because they're literate. They're used to working with the laws. They know what the government is all about. So that's the 5th of May. And you can kind of see this sort of process ramping up. So January is when the estates are called. The Cahiers come in. They're sort of compiled. By May, the Estates General, actually happens in Versailles, which is kind of southwest of central Paris. The next day, the Third Estate learns that although they had been sort of given to understand that that voting by head was on the table, it became clear that it wasn't. What the members of the Third Estate wanted what the king wanted was to say, okay, here's the things, here's what I'm proposing, let's all vote on it. End of story. And what the Third Estate said, the representatives of the Third Estate said, well, let's discuss it. Partly because they wanted the Third Estate to function or they wanted the Estates General to function as a sort of deliberative body, as opposed to just sort of something, we get together, we have a vote that we all know what the sort of end result is going to be, and then we all move on. But the Third Estate, partly the Third Estate too, is interested in, if there's going to be taxation, who do you want it to be on? Well, not you. You want it to be on these other people. On the 13th of June, the Third Estate invites the other estates to join these deliberations, which they are very disinclined to do, right? Because they are, once again, for lack of a better word, but you can kind of see why I'm using it, class conscious, right? So if you're a member of the Second Estate, if you're a member of the nobility, where do your interests lie? Well, they don't lie with a bunch of lawyers. They don't lie with a bunch of townspeople. They lie with the people who are like you, who you think are real people. And certainly they don't lie further down the income distribution with the peasants or whatever. Similarly with the clergy. The clergy is part of a sort of top-down bureaucratic organization, right? If you're a sort of clergy member of the Catholic Church, you really know what the order of, there's the Pope, there's the College of Cardinals, there's the bishops, and then there's me in church on Sunday, probably speaking Latin, which of course nobody understands, but it creates a kind of inbuilt solidarity. But what happens is that it starts to break down. And it starts to break down first with the clergy, and the reason is because a lot of the clergymen who are there are frontline parish clergy who are mostly not very well-to-do. And they have a much easier time seeing that they have a common interest with the members of the Third Estate than they do with the bishops and the other sort of higher-ups and the people running abbeys. Also, there's some flakage in this process from the nobility. Members of the nobility start to kind of see which way the wind is blowing. And, I mean, some of them have really right political ideas. Interestingly, the king's brother, whose name is Philip, later kind of changes his name to Philippe Égalité, Philip Equality, at the time that the kind of revolutionary demands of liberty, equality, fraternity are being voiced. The king is really horrified by this, right? For, you know, once again, it is legal because I will it, like is his sort of fundamental premise. And he really, poor old Louis, he was such a dope. He was really not a bad guy. I mean, he wasn't one of these like people who like to sort of stick it to the peasants. He just really thought, I mean, number one, he really just mostly liked hunting. He was not the sharpest tool in the shed. And what he wanted was for things to continue like they had been, and for him to be able to hunt and sleep with his mistress and, you know, all these things. He didn't want to have to be doing this stuff, which he didn't really think of as valid, right? He thought that this was like, why do I have authority? It's not because of these jokers. It's because of God. Like, I'm not really answerable to these people. I'm answerable to God, the guy that I got my authority from. So he eventually decides, well, I've had about enough of this. So on the 20th of June, this is another picture of the kind of setting. And on the 20th of June, the delegates show up at the hall in Versailles where they're supposed to meet, and it's locked. And this is the king saying, forget you guys. You know, we're not gonna do this sort of charade anymore. And the leaders of the Third Estate say, well, we've come too far. You know, we're now in this process where they've developed their own kind of class consciousness, if you will. Class consciousness is the wrong word for this, right? Because it's not really class in the sense that Marx used it, or in any kind of definable sense in that. But they've developed a kind of like group solidarity. They've developed a kind of identity as the Third Estate. So they look around for a place to meet, and it's not that easy to find a place for 350 people, right, to have a meeting. And they settle on an indoor tennis court about 6 blocks away. And they go there, there's a lot of futzing around, and finally, on the 17th of June, the Commons had declared itself a national assembly. And that's a key step here, because when you say that, you've now changed the nature of political power in the state, right? It's no longer the king says this is the case, so let it be written, so let it be done. Now it's, we have this deliberative body who's going to talk about what the laws should be. Maybe we're going to propose some laws of our own. At the very least, we're going to have some critical things to say about what the king thinks that the laws should be. And the king is just like, what? No, this is not how it goes here. This is not what God has decreed is going to be the case. So this is kind of why the lockout happens, that the Commons declares itself a national assembly. So they head to the tennis court, and there's people speaking all day. It's a very sort of rowdy scene, and people are very upset and very kind of confused about what's going to go on, right? Because, like, I don't know if you've ever been in a riot, but there's that moment at which you realize, like, things have gotten a little loose here. I'm not exactly sure, you know, what the deal is. Like, where's the power? Like, not that I've been in a lot of riots, but I've seen one or two. I mean, I was in a sort of like riot among football fans in Germany one time. The first thing I did was look for a police officer and go stand next to him. So I thought to myself, you know, this guy's a figure of authority. Whatever else is the case, like I'm less likely to get punched if I'm standing by this guy. But, you know, now they're in a situation where political power seems to be kind of in the balance in a way that it just has not been up to now. And that's alarming. right? They're sort of standing, they're around trying to decide, like, hey, what are we going to do? How are we going to go forward? Like, what's the way forward? And they all take an oath that they will not separate until they are established as a legitimate National Assembly. And this is perhaps the key moment, certainly of the early part of the revolution, because now you get another source of legitimate power. You get another group asserting that it has legitimate political power in the state. And that's a big deal. I mean, think about, like, not that I want to talk about modern politics, but think about June 6th, or January 6th. I mean, there's a lot of things you could say about that, but number one was the reason why a lot of people got upset about it in the sort of like more civilized, like less running around smashing things part of the country, is that it's a kind of challenge to the political order. Now, you may like the political order or you may not, but if the sort of basis of that political order suddenly changed, if there was somebody else in the country now who went to you and said, well, the basis of the political order in the United States has been we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, we're going to vote on it, whatever. If they then come to you and say, no, there's this other group that now says it has the power, that's a big deal. I mean, that'd be an alarming thing. And this is absolutely key, because France, in this sort of moment, goes from king, clergy, nobility, everybody else, in a sort of top-down, like, I forgot the key part here, God, king, down the line, to the people at the bottom saying, no, we have a right to sort of discuss how things are going to be. That's crucial. So within about a week, the king sort of relents and says, okay, you guys can be a National Assembly. By the way, there's a sort of moment at which, like, they have a kind of like, they meet in this big hall, and the sort of more monarchist-oriented people sit on the right side, and the more like Third Estate-oriented people sit on the left side, and that's where we get our left and right as political terms. There was also what's called the mountain, the montagne, where like the really radical people sat in the seats up above. They were called the montagnards, and they were like, when things really got crazy, they were like bad news. But one thing that does happen, and this is July the 14th, so you can see like basically about 3.5 weeks after this, is that a crowd in France decides they're going to storm the Bastille, the great prison that's in Paris. There's not that many people actually locked up in the Bastille at this point, but it's a very symbolically important moment. The commandant tries to sort of defend it. He has the Swiss guards who are there, like, open fire on the crowd. It turns out to be a very bad idea, because then the crowd seizes them and basically like executes him in the street, and a lot of the Swiss guards as well too. But this is the sort of moment at which a second thing starts to change. So you have a kind of devolution of power from God, king, nobles, clergy, down to the Third Estate, right? And then you have the people in the streets saying, well, we're very dissatisfied with how things are going, and we're not going to have some meeting out in Versailles about it, right? We're going to go where the action is. And that's the start of something of a dynamic that gets going in a rather different direction. There's a sort of moment that happens in disturbances like this. I recall, I mean, it's worth recalling the English Civil War, the Putney debates, when the levelers and the sort of more radicals in the New Model Army went to Oliver Cromwell and said, and the leaders of the New Model Army, well, you said that the people should rule, and Cromwell says, we didn't mean you people. We meant like responsible, nice members of the squirearchy like we are. And the same way with the lawyers out in Versailles, like we didn't mean like the hoi polloi running around the wine bars and what have you in Paris. When we say we want political power devolved, what we mean is we want it devolved to the kind of responsible people in the country. So the tennis court oath is this absolutely crucial moment in the sense that it starts this process of shifting political power down from the absolute monarch at the top, down to this kind of layer of professionals, lawyers, people with a certain amount of means. But at the same time, this other dynamic is starting too. And this, as the revolution goes on, is a sort of point at which things become more and more dangerous, because once you unhitch the sort of straps of political power, if you will, restraining or keeping the kind of order the way it's been, then other groups can contend for political power as well. So there's a lot of debate about the French Revolution still to this day. I mean, it's one of those things, there's a chair of French Revolutionary Studies at the main French university. I mean, it's a big sort of part of their culture. And you will notice that where we have the 4th of July, the big French holiday in the middle of summer is Bastille Day on the 14th of July, when the Tour de France is always going, and like every French cyclist is like turning themselves inside out, because the one thing you want to do if you're a French cyclist is win on Bastille Day. It's the big, and this is what's celebrated. It's not the night of June 20th. It's this. So a lot of people look at the French Revolution, you know, there's this sort of devolution that goes on to the middle classes, and then things start getting more and more radical until you get in 1793, you know, people heading off to the guillotine in tumbrils and revolutionary courts and the Committee of Public Safety. But so the reason why I wanted to stop at the tennis court oath is because it's this sort of, that's the moment when the world kind of turns upside down, when political power starts to shift to something that makes more sense to us, right? Like, I'm going to assume, just in my credulous way, that nobody here wants a king. I mean, I guess there are some benefits to a king, but we don't want one because we're not used to one, right? Like, you know, we don't go around like, wow, God, it'd be great if we had a king. We're used to, like, democracy. Democracy, Churchill is supposed to have said, he probably didn't, but the statement makes a good point. Democracy is the worst form of government known to man, except for all the other ones. Like, you know, democracy has its problems, but it's still probably the best we're going to do, at least so far as like the modes of government that we've discovered so far. So I think that the reason that we should find the tennis court oath interesting is because it's this moment when the world kind of turns upside down, or maybe gets right side up. It gets to sort of that way of understanding the way political power is and who has it and how it's exercised, that's kind of similar to the way that we understand it.